The morning light spilled across my workbench, catching on the gilded trim of the jewelry box I'd spent weeks restoring. It had belonged to my grandmother, a woman who believed beauty was meant to be used, not locked away. The wood was dark walnut, its surface now polished to a satin glow with a delicate brass clasp that clicked shut with satisfying precision. Inside, in a compartment only I knew existed, lay the original deed to Calvinor Wharf House, photographs of the painstaking restoration work, and a notarized statement naming me as the sole owner. I wrapped it carefully, layering tissue paper around its edges before settling it into a deep blue box. A silk ribbon in the same shade ran between my fingers before I tied it into a neat bow. The gift was more than a keepsake. It was a promise to Leora that this piece of our history would always belong to her. By late afternoon, I was dressed in a soft slate dress and my good coat. The drive to the restaurant was short, but my mind wandered the whole way. I pictured Leora's smile when she opened the box, the way her eyes might soften at the sight of something so personal. The restaurant stood at the edge of the harbor, glass walls framing the winter sea. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of rosemary and lemon. Conversations mingled with the clink of cutlery. I spotted Leora at the far end of the room. Her dark hair swept up, a shimmer of gold at her ears. She looked beautiful, though something in her expression, distant and taut, kept me from calling out just yet. I wove between tables crowded with Beckett's associates in tailored suits and perfectly pressed dresses. They glanced at me, some with polite nods, others with quick, assessing eyes. I found an empty chair at the edge of the long table and settled in, resting the gift beside my plate. I reached for my water glass, listening to the hum of conversation around me, when Beckett's voice suddenly cut through the room, crisp and deliberate. Beckett stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the back of Leora's chair, the other holding a wine glass. His smile was the kind meant for an audience, not for the person he was looking at. The low chatter faded as he tapped the rim of his glass with a fork. "Before we move on," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I think it's best if Theen heads home. Tonight is for close friends." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The words landed with a dull weight. Each syllable meant to draw a line I wasn't welcome across. I felt the air thicken. The warmth of the room turned to something else entirely. Leora didn't meet my eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the white linen in front of her fingers, tightening around her napkin. I waited for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. I straightened in my chair, feeling every glance that flicked toward me. My hand found the gift box beside my plate. The ribbon pressed cool against my palm. I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, and gave a small, polite nod toward Beckett. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone even. A murmur rippled down the table. A man I didn't recognize leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing as if he'd just seen something he shouldn't have. I turned, walking between the tables the same way I'd come in my heels, muted against the carpet. The smell of rosemary trailed after me, growing fainter with each step. Outside, the winter air closed in around me, brisk and salt-laced. I walked to my car without looking back, the gift still in my hand. I set it gently on the passenger seat, the bow glinting faintly in the dim light. The engine hummed to life, and I drove away from the harbor, the reflections of the restaurant's glass walls shrinking in the rearview mirror. The box remained untouched beside me all the way back to Rockmere, where the lights of Miss's kitchen window waited like a quiet harbor of their own. Miss had the kettle on before I had even stepped fully into her kitchen. The familiar scent of chamomile drifted through the air as I set the gift box on the table. She glanced at it, but didn't ask, only poured the steaming water into 2 cups and slid one toward me. I told her what had happened, each detail unspooling between sips of tea. Her brows drew together, deepening the lines at the corners of her eyes. "That man's been edging you out for years," she said. "First, it was suggesting Leora not make the drive down here. Then, it was canceling the lunches you'd planned with her friends. He doesn't just want her attention, Theron. He wants control of everything around her." I turned the cup in my hands, watching the thin swirl of steam rise. "He's been circling Wharf House for a while. Every time he visits, he talks about maximizing the property's potential." I thought it was just business chatter. Miss shook her head. "Business chatter doesn't come with shutting you out of your own daughter's life." I glanced at the gift box. The walnut gleamed softly under the kitchen light. I'd meant it as a gesture of love, a reminder of our family's roots. But now, with Beckett's eyes in my mind, it looked like bait, the kind of thing he'd seize if he could. "I'm glad you didn't give it to her," Me said, as if reading my thoughts. "Once something leaves your hands, you don't get to choose where it ends up." Her words settled in my chest like an anchor. I thought of the hidden compartment inside the jewelry box, the folded deed tucked between layers of felt. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was the legal heart of Wharf House, and in the wrong hands, it could be stripped away. I pushed my chair back and rested a hand on the box. "I'll keep it here for now," I said, my voice steady. "But I need to know exactly what he's planning." Miss nodded slowly. "Then you'll need to listen without being seen." 2 days later, I drove to Leora's house with a scarf I'd knitted in her favorite moss green shade. I told myself it was just a small gesture, a way to remind her I was still thinking of her, despite the awkwardness of the party. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their driveway as I stepped out of the car. I was halfway up the path when voices drifted from the back patio. I slowed my hand, tightening on the scarf. Beckett's tone was low but carried a sharp edge. "Once she signs over the Wharf House, it's ours," he said. "We'll frame it as preserving history. People love that kind of thing." A man I didn't recognize chuckled. "And her mother, she's out," Beckett replied without hesitation. "That scene at the party, step 1. Make her feel unwelcome. Keep her at a distance. Once she's not around, Leora will be easier to convince." The words hit like a cold tide. I pressed myself back against the hedge, the scent of damp leaves thick in the air. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I stayed still, forcing each breath to come slowly, silently. The conversation shifted to other topics: timelines, contacts, possible buyers. I caught enough to know they'd been thinking about this for longer than I'd realized. My scarf felt heavy in my hands, the stitches suddenly meaningless against the weight of what I just heard. I retraced my steps quietly, the gravel crunching underfoot, sounding too loud in the stillness. Once in the car, I set the scarf on the passenger seat where the jewelry box had been days before. The parallel wasn't lost on me. Both carried something meant for Leora, and neither could be given now. Driving away, I kept my eyes on the road, my mind already turning over what I'd overheard. The edges of Beckett's plan were taking shape, and so was my response. I didn't yet know all the details, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: nothing in that jewelry box could leave my possession. Back home, I went straight to the study and unlocked the cabinet where the jewelry box sat. The walnut surface caught the dim light, warm and steady, as if it knew its importance. I carried it to my desk and eased open the lid. The faint scent of cedar greeted me, a trick my grandmother had used to keep moths away. Beneath the velvet lining, my fingers found the familiar ridge in the wood. I pressed gently, and the panel lifted, revealing the compartment no one else knew existed. Inside lay the deed to Calvinor Wharf House, folded in its original envelope, the inked edges softened by time. The photographs were there, too, sepia images of the house in its earliest days, later ones from the restoration work I'd overseen myself. The notarized statement rested on top, the embossed seal catching the light. I touched each item in turn as if to confirm their reality. This wasn't just paper. It was proof, unshakable legal binding. Beckett could spin his stories to investors and charm half the town, but without these, his plan was nothing. Still, I knew keeping them in my home wasn't enough. I needed to protect them in a way he couldn't undo with a smile or a signature forged under pressure. I closed the compartment, rethreaded the ribbon through the clasp, and placed the box back in the cabinet. At my desk, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in months. Rowan Datch, my lawyer. The line rang twice before his measured voice answered. "Rowan, it's Theron. I need to meet with you urgently." There was a pause, then a shift in his tone. "Bring whatever you have and come first thing tomorrow. We'll make sure it stays yours." I ended the call, slid the jewelry box into my leather satchel, and locked the cabinet behind me. The click of the lock was a small sound, but it carried a finality that settled in my chest. Tonight, the documents would stay close. Tomorrow, they would be untouchable. Rowan's office smelled faintly of old paper and polished oak, a comforting mix that steadied me as I set the jewelry box on his desk. He opened it carefully, lifting the false panel with a precision that told me he understood its weight before he even saw what was inside. He examined the deed, first running a fingertip over the embossed seal. Then came the photographs, each one a testament to the years of work and care poured into Wharf House. Last, the notarized statement, the anchor tying it all together. "You're the sole legal owner," he said. "No question. But if you think someone might try to force a transfer, we'll need to act before they do." I nodded. "Beckett's planning to get Leora to convince me to sign it over. He's already telling people the property will be his." Rowan leaned back, considering. "We can file an injunction of formal restriction. No sale, no mortgage, no transfer without your explicit consent. It'll show up in any title search. Even if he tried to pressure you, the process would grind to a halt." "Do it," I said, "and send the notice to his office directly. I want him to read it with an audience." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I'll draft it now." For the next hour, we went through signatures, filings, and copies. Each paper I signed felt like another layer of armor over the house. When it was done, Rowan handed me the originals to keep in my safe and promised the injunction would be active by the end of the day. I left his office with the box back in my satchel, the documents now doubly protected, once by law and once by my own resolve. Outside, the wind off the harbor was sharp, but it carried a clean bite that made me breathe deeper. By the time I reached home, I could picture Beckett at his desk, the letter in hand, his confidence fraying at the edges. And when the moment came, I wanted to be ready to watch it happen. The call came 3 days later, just after lunch. Leora's name lit up my phone, and for a moment I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered, my voice neutral. "What did you do?" she asked, skipping any greeting. Her tone was tight, almost clipped. Beckett came home fuming. He said, "You've sabotaged an important deal." I kept my reply steady. "I've protected what belongs to me and to this family. If a deal fell through, perhaps it wasn't as solid as he claimed." She exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath since the moment she dialed. "You could have talked to us first." I think we both know how that conversation would have gone. There was a pause. In the background, I caught muffled voices, the sound of a door closing. Then her tone softened, if only slightly. "He said investors pulled out because of some legal complication. They're worried about title issues now." "That's what legal complications tend to do," I said. Leora didn't respond right away, and I imagined her weighing loyalty against unease. "Finally," she muttered. "He's been impossible since the letter arrived. Snapping at everyone, barely sleeping." I said nothing to that. Let her sit with the image of him unraveling. When she spoke again, it was quieter. "He told me the injunction makes it look like the property isn't really ours to use, that people will think we're unstable. Or," I said gently, "it shows that the property is firmly in the hands of the person who's cared for it all these years." Another pause. "Then I need to see you, just us." We agreed on the following afternoon at my house. I hung up and sat for a long moment, the phone warm in my hand. The tide was shifting. I could feel it in the edges of her words, the hesitation that hadn't been there before. Beckett's confidence was fracturing, and once the crack had started, it would only spread. The next move, I knew, would decide how wide it would break. Leora arrived the next afternoon, her car pulling up with a deliberate slowness, as if she were still deciding what to say. I met her at the door and ushered her inside, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air. She didn't bother with small talk, only followed me to the dining table where I had already laid out a folder. I opened it and slid the contents toward her. "These are the original deed restoration records, and the notarized statement confirming I am the sole owner of Wharf House. No loopholes, no conditions, no shared claims." She sat down, her fingers brushing the edge of the documents. Her eyes moved over the embossed seals, the dates, the signatures. "Why show me this now?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know the truth before Beckett tells you his version." Her jaw tightened at his name, but she didn't look up. I could see her piecing things together, the weight of it pressing against her silence. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the moment. Through the window I saw Beckett striding up the path, his shoulders squared, his expression already set in confrontation. The front door opened before I could move toward it. He stepped into the room, eyes darting to the table. "So this is where you've been," he said to Leora, then to me. "And this is what you've been hiding." I stayed seated. "Not hiding, protecting. You had no right," he began. But Leora cut in sharply. "No right to keep her own home. No right to stop you from selling it out from under her." Beckett's mouth opened, then closed. The confidence I'd seen at the party was gone, replaced by something smaller, meaner. He looked between us, realizing for the first time that the ground had shifted. Leora pushed the folder back toward me, her voice steady. "We're not doing this your way anymore." He stared at her for a long beat, but she didn't waver. And in that stillness, I knew the break between them had already begun. Beckett's gaze flicked from Leora to me, his voice tightening. "You don't understand what you're throwing away. That property could set us up for life. For your life, maybe," Leora said, her tone sharp enough to cut the air. "Not mine, and certainly not my mother's." He tried to laugh it off, but it came out brittle. "This is sentimentality talking. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment." "Better that than greed," she shot back. The words seemed to land harder than she intended. His jaw worked, but nothing came out for a moment. Then, as if grasping for control, he turned to me. "You're making her choose between us." "I'm not making her choose anything," I said evenly. "I'm showing her the facts. What she does with them is her decision." For a long second, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. Beckett's shoulders rose and fell, his control slipping in plain view. Finally, he reached for the folder, but Leora's hand shot out, pressing it firmly to the table. "No," she said. "You've taken enough without permission." His face darkened, and I saw the moment he realized there was no winning here. Not today. Without another word, he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked out the door. The sound of his car starting was sharp and abrupt, fading down the street until the silence settled back in. Leora stayed seated, staring at the folder like it was both a weight and a shield. When she finally looked up, there was a weariness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. "I think I need some time away from him," she said quietly. "To think, to breathe." I nodded, not pushing her for more. There would be decisions ahead, but for now, the tide had turned enough to give her space. She stood, slipping her arms into her coat, and I walked her to the door. As she stepped outside, the winter wind caught the edge of her hair, and she didn't look back. I closed the door slowly, already knowing what I would do next. Months passed, and the seasons shifted quietly around Rockmere Wharf House. Once the silent witness to so many plans and betrayals, it opened its doors for a community, gathering a celebration of history and hope. Leora stood beside me as neighbors and friends toured the old halls, their voices filled with admiration and curiosity. I watched her greet each guest, her smile genuine, no longer guarded or strained. The weight she'd carried had lessened, replaced by a newfound resolve that reminded me of the young girl who used to run barefoot along the docks. The documents, the fight, and the fractures of the past had all led us here to a place where the house belonged not just to us, but to everyone who cherished its story. When a group of longtime residents asked about the future of Warfare House, I answered simply, "It stays in the family." The words felt like a promise, steady and unyielding. As the afternoon light softened, Leora and I stood on the porch overlooking the harbor. The water mirrored the sky's gentle hues, the tide ebbing and flowing in timeless rhythm. I turned to her, feeling the quiet strength between us that had grown through the storm. Sometimes I said the best gift is knowing when not to give it. She looked at me, her eyes bright with understanding and something deeper, respect earned through trials shared. And sometimes, I added softly, silence says the most. We stood there a moment longer, letting the harbor's calm wash over us. The fight was far from over, but the legacy was ours to protect, rooted not just in deeds and documents, but in the unspoken bond that no power could undo. Together we stepped back inside, ready to face whatever came next, stronger, united, and certain that this house would be a home for generations to come.